Wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
Hello folks, welcome to episode 69 of an ongoing series where we basically take the camera anywhere we want and we try to find secrets and new discoveries to some of our favorite games. I think some of you hacky folk kind of messed with the poll, but you know what? I'll give it to you anyway. I think Half-Life 2 is a great segue episode into October where we're going to do all horror games. It's not quite horror, but it's not exactly sunshine and rainbows either. So with that said, let's take a closer look at Half-Life 2. The first thing that I want to look at is, of course, what happens at the very start of the game. You see G-Man basically introducing himself to Gordon Freeman. You kind of saw him in my episode's intro, but you didn't see the stuff that was going on through his body. And through his body, you can see a background image of other areas of the game. Like, for example, the chamber that started all the events of Half-Life in general, as well as some things that you're going to see at the end of Half-Life 2. If you take yourselves right outside of the map at the very start of the game, you're going to find some things that you weren't meant to see almost immediately. In fact, I can list off at least 3 things here that are worth noting. Here you can see that low poly chamber that we were talking about, and you can tell that it was specifically designed to look just like it did in the original game. But that's not the only thing you can see. You can also find the prison chambers that can be found at the end of the game. There are dedicated rooms that are completely outside the map that allows us to use those objects in that one tiny scene. Gotta give credit to Valve for showing a ton of commitment to the Half-Life franchise here. And there are 2 other things here that are pretty interesting. One of which is this long black box, which I'm pretty convinced now is what was used to store the G-Man and the particle effects that was used in the intro. Now, without definitive proof, I could still always be wrong here, but I back myself up with what we're gonna see at the very end of this episode. But for now, all you can really see inside of this black box is this one texture. And the developers at Valve are hardly ones to ever waste something, at least in this particular game. So since its purpose isn't immediately obvious, we can connect the dots. And that other thing I wanted to show you guys is something that we're going to be taking a lot of focus on in this particular episode. And that is the use of projecting a character onto a screen in the game world, while at the same time having an actual room to store these characters in. Like for example here, you can see the model at play, and then when the signal cuts out, the texture is thrown in front of the face, as well as a funny animation that the player's not meant to see.
Stay or passing through on your way to parts unknown? Welcome to City 17. It's safer here.
I can pretty much figure out why a lot of people wanted me to cover Half-Life 2 as an episode. There's a ton of twists and turns that you're not allowed to go to as the player. Like for example, right here at the very beginning of the game, there's a gate that's closed off to you. The door doesn't open. And the player's only allowed to see that there's actually another hallway that they can't reach. Well, the sad truth is that a lot of these twists and turns that you're not able to reach as the player oftentimes meets a very quick end. And there is something to be said about all this. I find it really impressive that the lighting used in this game is used very effectively to make the world seem a lot larger than it is, while at the same time saving a lot on resources. Like here, if we turn on the full bright, we can see that this inaccessible hallway is really tiny. And I can confirm that the largest sum of all these types of spaces are exactly the same way. But I'll still remember to show 1 or 2 more examples before the episode's over. Now we're going to talk about how skyboxes work in Valve games. See, when I did my Portal 2 episode, I didn't specifically call it a skybox, and that upset a lot of very passionate Valve fans. Big reason for this is that there's developer commentaries for almost every recent Valve game, and you can learn a lot through them. So when I failed to call their version of a skybox, I was called out. But to be fair, the way that Valve handles skyboxes is incredibly unusual. See, what they do is that they have a model of the background stored somewhere in the area, and then the version of the skybox that you see in the game is projected. So in a sense, this is not actually where the skybox is. Instead, the skybox tends to be like way off in the distance down below wherever you are in Half-Life 2. Trigger triggers are used in almost every single modern 3D game. It's a must-have game development feature in order to do a show like Sequence Break, but Valve games have a very special treat. In the console commands, you can activate a physical representation of where the triggers are. Like for example here, this guard will leave you alone unless you step over that trigger. That tells the game to allow the guard to pull out his weapon and start hitting you. The beginning of Half-Life 2 especially gives you a lot of little peeks into the window of the society that you are walking through. However, you're usually stopped by a guard or a locked door, and you don't really get a good look at what's going on. This one scene especially is kind of interesting. The scene implies that the guards go in there and start beating up this guy for whatever reason. But if we were to take the camera inside of this apartment, in truth, what's really happening here is the furniture is just being flown around almost like it was done by a ghost, and the resident that lives in this apartment happens to already be dead on the ground before the guards even show up. But from the perspective of the player, what little you are allowed to see combined with the sound effects paints the intended picture in your head for you. So in this scene, I have two things to show you. The first is that you can see these monitors here inside this room, but once again, this is something that's projected from something outside of the area. And in this particular case, it's right behind it. It's really cool. You can actually see that the image just scrolls across really slowly, which gives the effect on the screens like a camera is panning a certain direction. And even further than that, we can find one of the G-Man sightings. Now, I'm not going to show you all the G-Man sightings. It's going to get kind of repetitive, kind of fast, but I'm going to show you a couple here and there. And the reason why it gets really repetitive is because I'm sure a lot of you want to know where the G-Man goes whenever you do spot him. Unfortunately, this is one example that will represent all of them, in which the G-Man just simply disappears the second that he's off screen. And now let's turn our attention away to a viewer request. At any time, you can follow me on Twitter and give me any kind of request that you want to see in the next episode. Now, this particular week, I can't get to every single viewer request because most of them have the same result as the G-Man itself. But this one was pretty popular, and they wanted to know what happens to the head crab after it goes through the vent. Well, sorry to say, the second that it's out of the player's view in a normal sequence, the head crab Lamar disappears.
From me. Here, my pet. Up. No, not up there. No. Careful, Lamar. Those are quite fragile. Oh, fine.
In this scene, Barney comes out of a door on a raised ledge and gives Gordon the signature crowbar. But if you take the camera into a bird's eye view, you can actually see that the crowbar isn't there. It's only loaded into the scene when it's necessary. And the door that Barney came from? Well, it only houses a very small closet space, which is actually kind of funny because in this building in particular, there's an unused area that's completely unused by the player. Although not fully complete, this area does have its own floor and doors, and the floor tiles are very unique to themselves. Here's another example of how the developers were so effective with lighting. Here you can see these sewer tunnels that seem to go off into the distance to the point where it just turns into complete darkness. Now, if I hadn't forced you to think about this critically, you may have just assumed that this tunnel actually goes in pretty deep and you'd want to see how far it actually goes. However, when you make everything in this game bright, you can actually see that these tunnels end pretty quickly, and at the end of these tunnels are actually just two brick wall textures. Here in this tunnel, we got an unusual enemy placement. If you look up, you can see that there's grating that leads out into the outside world. But one thing you can't see is this armored guard that you're not even able to engage with until later in the game. I haven't got a clue what he's doing here. I mean, he's not even supposed to attack Gordon. There's no triggers for it. Next up is another viewer request, and it's a really simple one. The viewer wanted to know if there really is a face underneath the head crab, specifically when the head crab is actually on the face. Now, if you were to blow these guys away with a shotgun, you can reveal the face naturally in-game. But this person just wanted to verify whether or not the face is there at all times, and as it turns out, it is. Also, let's take a look at what Gordon Freeman looks like in the third person. And for some reason, he's not textured properly in Half-Life 2. Instead, it's a stand-in model with what looks like a concrete texture. This third person mode is completely underdeveloped. In fact, other things that interact with Gordon Freeman don't seem to affect the model in any way. Like, for example, here with this boat, he just disappears the second he goes inside. Speaking of boats, let's do a zoom out of one of the winding areas that the boat has to travel through in this particular chapter of the game. Now, the entire canal here is not represented. As you know, there's lots of loading segments during this one part of the game. But with that said, it's pretty amazing how huge this part of the game is when you consider the fact that this is only like 1/6 of the entire area. Now, originally I was just going to use this segment as another example of how they make areas look larger than they actually are, but instead we got something much better. We actually have ourselves a low poly Peach moment, and by that I mean if we zoom the camera in on this guy's face, we can see that because he was so far off in the background, the developers knew that they could just make his face with a lower poly count and lower texture resolution to save on resources. Not too common in this game, so I was really surprised to see this guy break the norm. Now here's a zoom out of the training area where you get the gravity gun. Like with anything that's displayed on a screen in Half-Life 2, you can actually find it somewhere in the adjacent area. And this part with Eli is no different. But one of the cool things about this scene specifically is how when the monitor cuts out, there's actually a physical box that displays in front of the camera that's pointing at Eli. Here's a uncommon sighting of the G-Man. A lot of people tend to miss this one because you have to go all the way to the end of this train and then crouch in order to catch a small glimpse of him. And I just wanted to take this moment to show you physical proof of how the G-Man just simply disappears the moment he's off screen. Here's another instance of a character that is off screen so that they can be recorded in a box and displayed on a monitor. Although I gotta say, it's kind of strange that they actually have real textures for these boxes. I would just imagine it'd be completely black or just have a placeholder texture. This right here is a clear-cut case of how a trigger works. As you probably just noticed a second ago, after I moved a certain amount of distance, these leeches start attacking Gordon Freeman. However, if we turn on the physical representation of triggers, you can literally see the line in which you can swim and you can get eaten alive. So here's two more examples of characters being broadcasted onto a monitor screen. I just find this way too fascinating. For example, here you can see the exact spot where the prisoners and Eli are being held, as well as the end transmission graphic that gets displayed on the screen afterwards. And just after that, we can see where Mossman was speaking with Wallace Breen. This room in particular is really strange. It's very elongated for seemingly no reason, and you can also kill Wallace Breen. Okie doke. But even stranger than that, you can see a picture of Wallace Breen facing Mossman. Of course, the player would never be able to see that whatsoever, so there's no point in having that picture there, especially if it's not broadcasting the actual face of Wallace. So I thought this was kind of unusual, but hey, I guess the voice has to come from somewhere, right? Even though there is no monitor capture of Dr. Kleiner has to be loaded into the game in order to speak. So if we take the camera over to here, we could see that, wait a second, they do have a placeholder texture? How come they didn't use it this whole time? How come this is the only time they have the placeholder texture? Well, this is a strange one. But what you can see here is it says wall with 128 over 128. The numbers here represent the height and width of the pixels. Here's a part where there's an inaccessible area of the game. The gate is normally locked, and behind that is just a concrete wall where the door is supposed to be. But if we take the camera through that concrete wall, we can actually see there's an unused hallway that cannot be reached by the player. Here's another zoom out of the city under siege. Fulbright is turned on this time so you can see all the details of this area. Here's the last character monitor room that we're going to be looking at in this episode. This one's for a very mysterious character that later gets introduced in the episodes of Half-Life 2, though you might find this little tidbit kind of fun. The character model for this creature in Half-Life 2 is actually different in detail from the one that is used in the episodes. And at the end of Half-Life 2, you meet the G-Man himself one more time, and he teases you with cryptic wording that leads you into episode 1 and 2, as well as, well, never mind. Point is, we found the room where this event takes place. In here, we can find the triggers that are used, as well as the particle effects that are used during this final scene. And lastly, we find this hallway that's really long, and it actually belongs to the door that G-Man steps through before he famously says,
This is where I get off.
Guys and gals, thank you so much for watching the Half-Life 2 episode of Boundary Break. It was a long time coming. A lot of people were asking about it, especially after the Portal 2 episode, so I was happy to get that out of the way. So I've been waiting all year for this. October is going to be all horror games, and one of the ones that we're going to do first is the most requested horror game on my channel, Silent Hill 2. So look forward to that. There's also going to be a new sequence break that is horror themed, and I bet you can guess which game that's going to be. And yeah, 2 other horror games as well. So if you're a horror game fan, or if you are afraid of horror games and you like to disarm them in some way, my show will do that for you. But yeah, this is my new camera, my new lights. I hope you guys liked it. Doesn't mean that Pat's gone forever. It just means that I can now film when he's busy, or I gotta do something on the fly. So let me know what you think of it, and guys, I'll see you next week. Take care.